welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohn, and today our guest is one of the country's wittiest and best-known political commentators, Molly Ivins. Molly Ivins writes a nationally syndicated column for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and is the author of a number of best-selling books, including most recently Bushwhacked, which she wrote with Lou DuBose. Molly Ivins, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thank you. Of course, there's nothing more disconcerting than being introduced as terribly witty.
I don't expect you to be witty.
She's one of the funniest people in the whole world. And then people listen to me and go, what is funny about that?
Well, you can always say you're witty on paper.
Very good.
Right? Tell us a little bit about how you started out in this impossible profession of journalism.
Well, there is, and it was more so than there still is, unfortunately still is, a kind of hazing that young journalists are put through, your cub reporters. It's a bit like the Marine Corps, you know, there's some idealistic, well-educated young people setting out to change the world, and they wind up in a city room with some nasty old editor who says, listen, kid, I spent 3 years of my life eating dog poop, so can you. It'll be good for you. Make a man out of you. Put hair on your chest. You know, oh, great. So they send you out to cover lots of drivel. But I was always amused by it. And then I was lucky enough, both because I had an advanced degree and because I'm 6 feet tall, to get assigned to the police beat, which when I started in the business, it was quite rare for women reporters to be given real assignments. Basically, in those days, women were sent off to what was called the snake pit, the women's section, and condemned there to write about food, fluff, and fashion for the rest of their days. And I had, at a couple of the early papers I worked at, I noticed that I got special breaks just because nobody was ever going to look at me and say, oh, you poor, sweet, dainty, fragile little thing. We couldn't possibly send you out to cover a riot. It was, you know, having to get your butt out there.
So you account for getting these juicy assignments because of your height, not because of your temperament and your character and your personality.
There really is such a thing as sizeism as well as sexism. And since I towered over every editor I ever worked for,
and do you think, did you take advantage of the height, or did it simply work for you?
Well, I actually went back to get a graduate degree. It was apparent to me very early that unless you had an extra credential, you weren't going to get very far.
What was your graduate degree in?
Journalism. I got a master's degree in journalism from Columbia. But I think that's gone now. I think that young women have an equal opportunity of getting hired in the newspaper business. I think they have an equal opportunity of getting good assignments in the newspaper business. But as is true in almost every calling I know of, there is still a glass ceiling when it comes to top management.
And you don't see that being broken anytime soon?
Just 2 or 3 major newspaper executive editors are women to this good day.
Well, the Philadelphia Inquirer, we interviewed her. Amanda Bennett was here, yeah, and it was really kind of nice to see, as you say, it's rare to see a woman in that position. Well, Molly, you do have a distinctive voice as a journalist. It's an irreverent voice, I think. Perhaps, do you like that better than witty?
Yes.
Irreverent.
Yes, very good.
Is that your voice, or is that a voice you cultivated as you continued to write and you realized that this was your writing voice, or is this you? I often wonder about that with journalists.
I would say probably over the years it's become a little artificial. I've always known, for example, that if I didn't write with a Texas accent, I would be hanged at home. I mean, the only way I get away with writing about Texas the way I do is because I am one. If I had been an outsider and come in and made many of my observations, I think I would be persona non grata. Not that I'm real popular everywhere, but I was lucky enough, after I had been in establishment journalism for 3 or 4 years, 5 years, I gave it all up in 1970 to go back to Texas and try and save the world. I went to work for a tiny, tiny progressive magazine called the Texas Observer. And I thought at the time I was giving up all thoughts of ever working for the New York Times or winning a Pulitzer Prize. I was not going to have a career in establishment journalism. I was going to be part of the fighting alternative press. And of course, you know, on my tombstone I want it written, she never made a shrewd career move. But like many things in my life, it turned out to be an extraordinary stroke of luck, because what I got at the Texas Observer was what I could not have gotten at any other paper, certainly not at that point in my life, and it was complete freedom. I could write about whatever I wanted to. I could say whatever I wanted to. A remarkable little paper. And I was sent to cover the Texas legislature, and from the first day I walked on the floor of that house, it just struck me as the funniest thing I'd ever seen, and I couldn't wait to tell people about it. You know, it was so, I can remember...
you found your subject matter.
Yeah. Two legislators on the floor. You know, opening day is like the first day of school. Everybody's milling around and meeting and greeting, and one old boy shoves an elbow in the ribs of the other old boy and says, "Hey, you should see what I found myself last night." And she don't talk neither. And I'm sitting there going, these are the people who write the laws. And I just fell in love with the whole thing. It was like I had been offered a cross between the zoo and the circus.
And you found your métier.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, we were talking about this before the interview began. You said that as a reporter, you can sort of hide behind your notebook. And yet, you are 6 feet tall.
Yes.
And you are an irreverent voice. And of course, now you have a profile.
Right.
What do you think of that? Is there a tension between that being sort of in the background and sort of being there in the midst of things and recognized?
Well, one of the less fortunate things that has accompanied my minor degree of fame, I see what happens to journalists who are themselves celebrities, and I have lost the anonymity, which for me was one of the great attractions. I mean, it's true, when you have a notebook and a pencil in front of you, you're not whoever you are, an individual, you're just a reporter. You know, just a reporter.
Can you tell us about why you decided to write this book, Bushwhacked, which is essentially a critical indictment of George W. Bush?
Well, actually, I was actually tempted to start the introduction to this book by saying, if y'all had read my last book, you wouldn't have to be reading this one now. Well, because Lou DuBose and I, my writing partner, did a political biography of George W. Bush in 1999 that came out in 2000. And it was basically really a close examination of his record as governor, which led us to conclude that he was not going to make a very good president. But at that time, the X factor, the one thing we couldn't predict because he had no record in it, was foreign policy. And that, of course, has become the single most important aspect of his presidency, which is, I mean, you know, whether you like George Bush or not, the last thing in the world anybody would have wished on this guy was a major foreign policy crisis in his first year. Boy, was he not ready. And I, you know, just heard him, recently heard him in the presidential debate saying, when I ran in 2000, I never dreamt I would have to send men into battle. Well, you know, may indicate a lack of imagination on his part. If you were going to become president, it seems to me you ought to be prepared for that eventuality, but he didn't. I mean, it was a time of peace and prosperity, and the issues were completely different. What I try to do, and the one way I try to get people interested in politics, because I'm so convinced that it's important to their lives, is to talk about politics in terms of the way they have not, you know, who's ahead in the horse race and what clever behind-the-scenes move are being made by whoever. But I like to talk about politics in terms of how it directly affects people's lives. And what we did, the methodology in Bushwhacked, is we went out and talked to average, everyday, normal Americans, and of course found a bunch of extraordinary people.
Many of them Bush supporters.
As you do when you go out into this country. And we were looking at the ways their lives have been directly impacted by Bush. Actually, one of the stories is that here in Philadelphia, there was an elderly doctor who lived just off Rittenhouse Square who literally died. He was poisoned, died of a disease called listeriosis, which was in some prepared meat that he'd bought because he was supposed to be on a high-protein diet. And it's very common, this bacteria called listeriosis. It's a form of food poisoning. Now, under the Clinton administration, they were going to go ahead and tighten the regulations to make sure that meat was inspected for listeriosis contamination before it ever got into stores. But, of course, the Republicans are allied with the meat industry. They always have been. And they decided to let the standards slacken, literally. I mean, we've got the memos in the book. And this poor elderly gentleman, who was a well-known character at Rittenhouse Square, died of it.
So this was the direct effect of a particular policy, and that's what the book does, makes those connections. This was not at a level
that ever made headlines in the newspaper.
Right.
I mean, some assistant sub under a secretary of something or other, writes new regs that nobody ever pays attention to it. Nobody notices, and yet it has an enormous impact on people's lives.
I do think the book has, it seems like an obvious approach, which is to link the policy to the people, and yet you don't see that.
You really don't anymore. Politics has become so fixated on the horse race and the campaign consultants and the advertisement, and that's considered covering politics. And the idea that you would cover politics because, hey, Joe Dokes, it's going to cost you $300 what these fools just did here. It's going to cost your kid's life. If you don't tell people how, you actually hear Americans going out saying, well, I'm just not interested in politics. As though it were a picture on the wall or a program on television that you could stand back from and say, well, don't care for that much. You don't have a choice.
But do you blame the media for that?
Of course I do. I love to blame my own profession
you do blame
for
your
almost
profession.
everything that's wrong with the entire world.
So do you feel that the media has gotten worse in its treatment of these sorts of
I'm
things?
really almost hesitant to say this. I've been unnaturally optimistic my entire life, and so of course I assumed that I would become an unusually cheerful old fart. But I seem to be becoming a little grumpy here and there. And
about your own profession.
That makes me grumpy is journalism, the state of journalism today.
Well, you said before that to me that you speak Texan. And I guess George W. Bush also speaks Texan.
Well, he's not much of a Texas speaker. He has an accent, but he doesn't have the facility with language.
Okay, you want to explain then what you mean by speaking Texan?
There are two levels of this. Most Southerners use metaphor and simile very naturally. And many of the phrases that are considered amusing and novel here in the North when coming out of the mouths of a Texan are actually cliches in Texas. You say, well, he's just drunk, he's a peach orchard bore. Which has an obscure